The amber glow of Edison bulbs cast long shadows across the weathered oak tables of the Philosopher's Den, a tucked-away tavern in the heart of Georgetown where academic minds gathered to wrestle with ideas that had shaped civilizations. The evening rain drummed against mullioned windows, creating a cocoon of warmth inside the establishment that had witnessed countless intellectual battles over the decades. At a corner table near the fireplace, two figures sat across from each other, their contrasting demeanors immediately apparent to anyone observing. Charles-Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of French aristocracy, his silk waistcoat catching the firelight as he swirled a glass of Burgundy. His eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent decades studying the machinery of government, watching how power flowed through the corridors of Versailles and beyond. Across from him sat Thomas Hobbes, his more austere figure hunched slightly forward, hands wrapped around a pewter mug of ale. The Englishman's weathered face bore the lines of someone who had lived through civil war, who had seen firsthand what happened when authority crumbled and society descended into chaos. His dark eyes held a gravity that spoke of hard-won wisdom, born from observing humanity at its worst. The tavern buzzed with the low murmur of conversation from other patrons, professors debating literature, graduate students arguing over economic theory, journalists dissecting the latest political scandal. But at this particular table, a different kind of electricity crackled in the air. These two men had agreed to settle once and for all a question that had divided political thinkers for centuries. Should power be distributed among many hands or concentrated in the grip of one? "Gentlemen," said the bartender, a philosophy professor moonlighting to pay his mortgage as he set down a plate of cheese and bread between them. "The house rules are simple. No throwing punches, no storming out, and whoever loses buys the next round for everyone." Montesquieu chuckled, his French accent lending a musical quality to his words. "My dear Thomas, I hope you brought your wallet, though I suspect after tonight you might finally see the wisdom in dividing even that responsibility among multiple accounts." Hobbes's weathered face cracked into a rare smile, though his eyes remained serious. Bold words from a man who lived safely under the protection of absolute monarchy while theorizing about its limitations. "We shall see, my friend, whether your elegant theories can withstand the brutal realities I have witnessed." The Frenchman raised his glass. "To a worthy opponent, and an even worthier question. In an age where we see democracies struggling with paralysis and authoritarian regimes rising across the globe, perhaps there has never been a more crucial time to examine whether power is safer when scattered like seeds in the wind, or gathered like a sword in steady hands." "Indeed," Hobbes replied, lifting his mug, "though I would argue that your scattered seeds often sprout nothing but weeds of chaos, while my steady sword, properly wielded, can cut through discord to create the order that makes civilization possible." The two men drank, and the weight of their opposing worldviews settled between them like a chessboard before the first move. Around them, conversations continued, but the air at their table grew thick with anticipation. Both had spent lifetimes studying the same fundamental human problem: how to organize society in a way that maximized both freedom and order, prosperity and security. Montesquieu set down his glass and leaned forward slightly. "You know, Thomas, I have always admired your clarity of thought, even as I have disagreed with your conclusions. But tell me this, when you look at the world today, with all its complexity, all its interconnectedness, do you truly believe that any single mind, however brilliant, can possibly process enough information to govern wisely?" Hobbes's eyes sharpened. "And when you look at the world today, Charles, with its endless committees and bureaucracies and competing authorities, do you truly believe that this fragmentation leads to better decisions, or merely to the illusion of participation while real power operates in shadows?" The questions hung in the air like a challenge issued with elegant words, but deadly serious intent. Neither man was here for mere academic exercise. Both had lived through times when these theoretical debates translated into real consequences: wars fought, governments toppled, lives lost or saved, based on how societies chose to structure authority. Outside, the rain intensified, and inside the philosopher's den, two of history's greatest political minds prepared to engage in intellectual combat that would illuminate truths as relevant today as they were centuries ago. The fire crackled as Montesquieu leaned back, his fingers tracing the rim of his wineglass. The Frenchman's aristocratic bearing was evident in the way he carried himself, yet there was nothing pretentious about his manner. Rather, it was the confidence of someone who had observed power from within its inner circles and found it both fascinating and dangerous. "Let me begin with a story, Thomas," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to holding court. "When I was young, I watched King Louis XIV rule France with absolute authority. The Sun King, they called him, and indeed everything in the kingdom revolved around his will. One man making decisions for 20 million souls." He paused to sip his wine, letting the weight of those numbers settle. "And what did I see? I saw a system that worked magnificently when the king was magnificent. But I also saw what happened when human nature intruded, as it always does. Louis grew old, made poor decisions, became isolated from reality by the very courtiers who depended on his absolute power for their own survival." Hobbes set down his mug with deliberate care. "Your story proves my point rather than yours, my friend. Louis ruled for 72 years and transformed France into the dominant power in Europe. Compare that to the chaos of England during my youth: civil war, regicide, competing parliaments, religious factions tearing the kingdom apart. Which system served its people better?" "Ah, but that is precisely where we differ," Montesquieu replied, his eyes brightening with the thrill of intellectual combat. "You see stability and call it success. I see potential tyranny temporarily restrained by the accidents of personality. What happens when your absolute sovereign is not a Louis XIV, but a Nero? What checks exist on power run amok?" The Englishman leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "What checks exist on mob rule? What prevents democracy from becoming the tyranny of the ignorant masses? I lived through the execution of King Charles, watched as supposedly rational men turned into a bloodthirsty crowd baying for royal blood. You speak of the dangers of concentrated power, but I have seen the far greater danger of power without direction." Around them, the tavern's atmosphere seemed to thicken. Other conversations had quieted as patrons found themselves drawn to the gravity of the debate unfolding at the corner table. A young political science student at a nearby table pulled out her phone to record, then thought better of it and simply listened. Montesquieu gestured with his wineglass, the burgundy catching the firelight. "But you are creating a false choice, Thomas, between absolute power and chaos. What I propose is neither. I propose a system where power is divided among different branches, legislative, executive, judicial, each checking the others, preventing any single person or faction from accumulating too much control. And I propose that such division leads inevitably to paralysis," Hobbes countered. "Who decides when these branches disagree? Who breaks the deadlock when urgent action is required? Your separation of powers sounds elegant in theory, but in practice it becomes separation from responsibility. Everyone can point fingers at someone else when things go wrong." The Frenchman smiled, recognizing a worthy opponent. "You raise valid concerns, but consider this. Is it not better to risk occasional paralysis than to guarantee eventual oppression? Power, Thomas, is like fire. Contained and controlled, it provides warmth and light. Concentrated and unchecked, it burns everything in its path. And yet," Hobbes replied, his voice growing more intense, "without sufficient heat, the whole enterprise freezes to death. I have seen what happens when authority is weak, when every decision requires consensus from competing interests. The result is not thoughtful deliberation, but lowest common denominator governance that satisfies no one and serves nothing except the preservation of the system itself." A graduate student at the bar turned fully around on his stool, abandoning all pretense of not eavesdropping. The bartender had stopped polishing glasses and stood transfixed by the verbal duel unfolding before him. Montesquieu took another sip of wine and continued. "But here is what you miss, my English friend. Your system requires not just a strong sovereign, but a wise one. And wisdom, like virtue, is not hereditary. You are gambling the fate of millions on the personal character of whoever happens to sit on the throne. My system, by contrast, assumes that human beings are flawed and builds in protections against that fundamental truth." The criticism hit home, and Hobbes's jaw tightened slightly. "Your system assumes that flawed human beings, when divided into competing factions, somehow magically become less flawed. But multiplication does not solve the problem of human nature. It merely spreads it across more decision-makers while removing accountability. When everyone is responsible, no one is responsible." The tension in the air was palpable now, two brilliant minds circling each other like intellectual gladiators, each looking for the weakness in the other's philosophical armor. The rain outside had settled into a steady rhythm against the windows, creating a percussion that seemed to underscore the mounting tension at the corner table. Hobbes reached for his ale, noting how his hand remained perfectly steady despite the intensity of the debate. Years of political upheaval had taught him to maintain his composure, even when discussing matters of life and death, which he believed all political questions ultimately were. "Charles," he said, setting down his mug with careful precision, "you speak of my system as a gamble, but what is your cherished separation of powers, if not an even greater wager? You are betting that ambitious politicians, when given competing spheres of influence, will somehow restrain each other, rather than collude to preserve their collective power against the people they supposedly serve." Montesquieu's eyebrows rose slightly. It was a good point, and he appreciated intellectual honesty even from an opponent. "A fair critique, Thomas, but consider the alternative you propose. In your system, what prevents the sovereign from becoming corrupted by the very absolute power you wish to grant him? Lord Acton said it well: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Acton said that 2 centuries after we are both supposed to be dead," Hobbes replied with a slight smile. But his observation, while quotable, misses the crucial point. It is not power itself that corrupts, but the competition for power. A secure sovereign whose authority is unquestioned has no need for the petty corruptions and compromises that plague divided governments. The Englishman gestured toward the other patrons in the bar. "Look around this room, Charles. Watch how people behave when authority is clear and accepted. The bartender serves drinks, customers pay their bills, conversation flows peacefully. Now imagine if every drink order required negotiation between 3 different servers, each with veto power over the others. How long before chaos replaces efficiency?" Montesquieu chuckled, genuinely amused. "A clever analogy, but surely you see its limitations. A bartender serves drinks for a few hours. A sovereign rules human lives for decades. The stakes are rather different. Would you not agree?" "The stakes are exactly why my approach is necessary," Hobbes shot back, his voice gaining intensity. "You can experiment with committee governance when deciding what wine to serve at dinner. But when armies are marching toward your borders, when plague threatens your cities, when economic collapse looms, these are not times for debate and deliberation. These are times for decisive action." A hush had fallen over much of the tavern now. Even the bartender had abandoned his duties to listen, leaning against the bar with his arms crossed. Near the window, an elderly professor of history sat with his coffee growing cold, mesmerized by the intellectual drama unfolding. Montesquieu swirled his wine thoughtfully. "But that is precisely when checks on power become most crucial, Thomas. Crisis has always been the excuse tyrants use to justify their tyranny. Give me absolute authority to save you from this emergency, they say. And somehow the emergency never quite ends. And crisis has always been when divided governments collapse into paralysis," Hobbes countered. "While committees debate and factions maneuver for advantage, the enemy advances. While legislatures argue about procedure, cities burn. Your theoretical protections against tyranny become practical invitations to conquest." The Frenchman leaned forward, his aristocratic composure showing the first hints of passionate engagement. "Yet history shows us repeatedly that the greatest threats to human liberty come not from external enemies, but from internal oppression. More people have died under the boot of their own governments than in all the foreign wars combined." "History shows us no such thing," Hobbes replied firmly. "History shows us that weak governments invite both internal chaos and external aggression. The Roman Republic, with all its checks and balances, gave way to imperial autocracy precisely because divided authority proved inadequate to the challenges of governing a complex society. And that imperial autocracy gave us Caligula and Nero," Montesquieu shot back. "It gave us the madness of absolute power exercised without restraint. Tell me, Thomas, would you rather live under a system that might occasionally act slowly, or under one that might efficiently implement the whims of a lunatic?" Hobbes's weathered face darkened. "I would rather live under a system that acts at all. Your divided governments do not merely act slowly, they often cannot act at all. And while they dither and debate, real people suffer real consequences." The intensity of their exchange was drawing more attention now. A young couple at a nearby table had stopped their own conversation entirely, watching the philosophical titans clash as if observing a heavyweight boxing match. The woman whispered something to her companion about recognizing the names from her political theory classes. "You speak as if speed and decisiveness are always virtues," Montesquieu said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "But what good is swift action if it is swift action in the wrong direction? What benefit comes from efficient implementation of poor policy?" Better efficient mistakes that can be corrected than paralyzed indecision that allows problems to metastasize, Hobbes replied without hesitation. A wrong turn can be reversed. But while you are still arguing about which direction to go, you may find that you no longer have a choice in the matter. The fire crackled louder, as if emphasizing the heat of their intellectual combat. The debate had reached a crescendo of intellectual intensity when the bartender, emboldened by the electric atmosphere, approached their table. "Gentlemen," he said, setting down fresh drinks, "I hate to interrupt, but I have to ask, we are living through this debate right now, are we not? Brexit paralyzed Britain for years, while Parliament argued. Meanwhile, China builds infrastructure and implements policy at lightning speed. Which of you is winning in practice?" Montesquieu and Hobbes exchanged a look that mixed surprise with appreciation for the interruption. Real-world examples had a way of grounding even the most elevated theoretical discussions. "An excellent question," Montesquieu said, raising his fresh glass of wine toward the bartender, "and one that illustrates exactly why my approach is superior. Yes, Brexit created political chaos, but that chaos reflected genuine disagreement among the British people about their future. Better to work through that disagreement, however messily, than to have it imposed by autocratic decree." Hobbes took a long pull from his new ale before responding. "But at what cost, Charles?" "While Britain tied itself in knots for 3 years, real economic damage occurred. Real people lost real jobs. Real international relationships were strained or severed. Your love of process blinded you to the human consequences of indecision, and your love of efficiency blinds you to the human consequences of wrong decisions," Montesquieu fired back. "China may build infrastructure quickly, but they also build surveillance systems to monitor their own people. They implement policy efficiently, but often policy that serves the state rather than the individual." The bartender lingered, clearly hoping to hear more. Around the tavern, conversations had essentially stopped as patrons focused on the debate unfolding in their midst. Someone had quietly started a live stream on social media, and the viewer count was climbing rapidly as word spread about the extraordinary intellectual showdown taking place. Hobbes set down his mug and fixed Montesquieu with a steady gaze. "You say that as if democratic governments always serve individuals rather than state interests. But I have watched so-called representative governments wage wars their people opposed, implement policies their voters rejected, and serve special interests while claiming to serve the general good. Your checks and balances become elaborate theater to disguise the same fundamental reality: power serves itself." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Montesquieu felt it sting because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. Representative democracy had indeed produced outcomes that seemed to contradict the will of the represented. "I will not deny that democratic systems can be captured by special interests," the Frenchman admitted slowly, "but at least they can be reformed from within. At least citizens retain the theoretical ability to change their government through elections. What recourse exists against a tyrannical sovereign except revolution?" "Revolution," Hobbes said quietly, "is exactly what my system is designed to prevent. And that prevention serves everyone's interests, even those who dream of being revolutionaries. Because revolution, Charles, is not a surgical procedure that removes bad government while preserving everything else. Revolution is a forest fire that destroys the guilty and innocent alike." His voice carried the weight of personal experience, and Montesquieu recognized it. Hobbes had lived through the English Civil War, had seen what happened when political disagreement escalated beyond the boundaries of civilized discourse. "But surely you see the trap in your own logic," Montesquieu pressed. "If the only alternative to absolute authority is chaos, then any tyrant can justify any oppression by pointing to the specter of disorder. Your cure for political instability becomes the justification for political oppression. And your cure for political oppression becomes the guarantee of political instability," Hobbes countered. "We are back to the fundamental choice, my friend. Risk tyranny to avoid chaos, or risk chaos to avoid tyranny. I choose order because chaos is the greater evil." A young law student who had been listening intently finally spoke up from a nearby table. "But professors, is that really the only choice? Cannot we learn from history to design systems that minimize both risks?" Both men turned toward her, and Montesquieu smiled with genuine warmth. "An excellent question, and one that gets to the heart of our disagreement. I believe we can learn from history and design better systems. Thomas believes that human nature makes such improvements impossible. I believe that human nature makes such improvements dangerous," Hobbes corrected. Every attempt to perfect government has led to greater imperfection. Every revolution promising freedom has delivered different forms of oppression. Better to accept the limitations of human governance and design accordingly. The student persisted. But what about federalism? What about the American system that divides power both horizontally and vertically? Does that not provide some solution to your dilemma? Montesquieu's eyes lit up. Now you are thinking like a true student of political science. Federalism adds another layer of protection against concentrated power while maintaining enough authority at each level to ensure effective governance. Federalism, Hobbes replied dryly, adds another layer of competing authorities and jurisdictional disputes. It multiplies the opportunities for gridlock while reducing accountability even further. Who is responsible when local, state, and federal governments all point fingers at each other? The exchange was drawing attention beyond the tavern now. Social media was buzzing with clips and quotes from the debate, and political commentators were already beginning to weigh in on the fundamental questions being raised. The evening had deepened, and the tavern's lighting had grown more intimate as other patrons gradually departed, leaving behind only the most dedicated listeners to witness what had become an epic intellectual duel. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. At the corner table, two of history's greatest political minds were approaching the most personal territory of their debate. Montesquieu set down his wineglass and looked directly into Hobbes's weathered eyes. "Thomas, I want to understand something about your experience. You lived through the English Civil War, saw King Charles lose his head, watched Parliament turn into a revolutionary tribunal. That trauma shaped your thinking, did it not? Your preference for strong authority stems from witnessing the alternative." The question was asked gently, but it struck deep. Hobbes was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the condensation on his ale mug. When he spoke, his voice carried a gravitas that had been absent from even their most heated exchanges. "You are quite right, Charles. I was 14 when the war began, old enough to understand what was happening, too young to protect myself from its impact. I watched neighbor turn against neighbor, saw men I had respected become monsters in the name of righteousness. I witnessed the breakdown of every social bond that makes civilization possible." He paused, staring into the fire. "Do you know what haunts me most? It was not the violence itself, though that was terrible enough. It was the speed with which order collapsed once authority was successfully challenged. One day we had a functioning society, and the next we had armed gangs claiming divine mandate to settle political differences with swords." Montesquieu nodded slowly. "I can see how such an experience would shape one's political philosophy. But consider my own formation, Thomas. I came of age in the court of Louis XIV, watching absolute power operate from the inside. I saw how isolation from criticism corrupted even well-intentioned monarchs, how the absence of institutional constraints led to policy disasters that affected millions." "Tell me," Hobbes said, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. The Frenchman's aristocratic bearing softened as he recalled his youth. "I remember watching the king make decisions about war and peace based on personal slights from other monarchs. I saw him revoke the Edict of Nantes, driving hundreds of thousands of Protestants from France, not because of any compelling state interest, but because his confessor convinced him it would please God. The human cost was enormous, but who could tell the Sun King he was wrong? But the state survived," Hobbes pointed out. "France remained France. The alternative, religious civil war like we experienced in England, would have been far worse." "Survived, yes, but at what cost?" Montesquieu replied. "And for how long? The seeds of revolution were planted in that court, Thomas. When people have no voice in their governance, when they cannot petition for redress of grievances through peaceful means, eventually they find violent means. Your strong sovereign may prevent revolution in the short term, but he makes it inevitable in the long term." Around them, the remaining patrons had formed a loose semicircle, abandoning any pretense of conducting their own conversations. A prominent blogger was taking careful notes, while a documentary filmmaker who had wandered in for a drink was quietly coordinating with her crew to begin recording. Hobbes considered this argument seriously before responding. "But revolutions under divided governments happen just as frequently, Charles. The Roman Republic fell despite its checks and balances. The Weimar Republic collapsed despite its democratic institutions. When crisis comes, institutional protections prove to be paper barriers against determined enemies of order. Yet some divided systems have endured for centuries," Montesquieu countered. The British Parliament that executed your King Charles eventually became the foundation for constitutional monarchy that has lasted 300 years. The American experiment with separation of powers has survived civil war, world wars, economic collapse, and profound social change. Has it, Hobbes asked pointedly, or has it survived by gradually concentrating power in ways that would have horrified its founders? Look at the American presidency today compared to what the framers intended. Look at the administrative state that makes most significant decisions without any input from elected representatives. Your separated powers have reunited themselves through the back door. The observation was uncomfortably accurate, and Montesquieu felt compelled to acknowledge it. You raise a fair point about the evolution of American governance, but does that not prove the adaptability of divided systems rather than their failure? The concentration of power you describe happened through constitutional means, with popular acceptance, in response to genuine needs. It proves exactly what I have been arguing, Hobbes replied with growing intensity. Divided authority is unstable. It either collapses into chaos or reconstitutes itself as unified authority. The difference is that my approach acknowledges this reality from the beginning, while yours pretends it can be avoided through clever institutional design. A philosophy professor who had been grading papers in the corner finally abandoned her work entirely. "This is extraordinary," she whispered to her companion. "They are essentially debating whether human nature can be channeled by institutions or whether institutions must accommodate human nature as it actually exists." The comment reached both debaters, and they paused to consider its implications. The question hung in the air between them like a bridge connecting their opposing positions. The tavern had taken on an almost theatrical quality now, with the remaining dozen patrons arranged in a loose semicircle around the corner table, where two intellectual giants continued their epic confrontation. The bartender had long since abandoned any pretense of working, instead positioning himself where he could hear every word. Outside, the rain had intensified again, creating a cocoon of intimacy that seemed to encourage increasingly personal revelations. Montesquieu took a measured sip of his wine and leaned back in his chair, studying his opponent with renewed interest. "Thomas, that young professor raised a fascinating point about human nature and institutions. It occurs to me that our fundamental disagreement might be anthropological rather than political. You seem to believe that humans are essentially selfish and power-seeking, while I believe we are capable of rational self-governance when provided with proper incentives." Hobbes's weathered face showed the first genuine smile of the evening. "Now we are approaching the heart of the matter, Charles, and you are both right and wrong about my view of human nature. I do not believe humans are inherently evil. I believe they are inherently concerned with their own survival and advancement. This is neither good nor bad. It simply is." He gestured around the tavern. "Look at this room. Why does it function peacefully? Not because everyone here is naturally virtuous, but because the rules are clear, the authority structure is understood, and the consequences of disruption are predictable. Remove those elements, and this civilized gathering would become something very different very quickly." A young graduate student who had been listening intently finally worked up the courage to interject. "But Mr. Hobbes, does not that example actually support Professor Montesquieu's argument? This tavern is not ruled by an absolute sovereign. It operates through a combination of social norms, legal frameworks, and voluntary cooperation." Hobbes turned toward her with approval. "An excellent observation, and one that illustrates the complexity of the issue. But notice that all those elements you mention, social norms, legal frameworks, voluntary cooperation, ultimately rest on the background assumption of state authority. If someone started a fight in here tonight, we would call the police representatives of the sovereign's monopoly on legitimate violence." Montesquieu seized on this point. "But the police themselves operate under constitutional constraints, Thomas. They cannot simply do whatever they wish. They must follow procedures, respect rights, answer to civilian authority. Your sovereign monopoly on violence is itself divided and regulated." "In theory," Hobbes replied. "But when genuine crisis comes, those constitutional niceties evaporate remarkably quickly. Emergency powers, martial law, suspension of civil liberties, every divided government has provisions for bypassing its own checks and balances when circumstances demand it, which proves that even the most elaborate separation of powers recognizes the ultimate necessity of unified command." The documentary filmmaker had managed to set up her equipment discreetly, and now the debate was being recorded for posterity. Neither philosopher seemed to notice or care. They were too deeply engaged in the intellectual combat to worry about their audience. Montesquieu finished his wine and signaled for another. You speak of crisis as if it were the natural state of human affairs, Thomas. But perhaps the frequency of crisis in your worldview reflects the instability created by concentrated power itself. Absolute rulers have historically been more prone to foreign adventures, domestic oppression, and economic mismanagement, precisely because they face no constraints on their decision-making. And divided governments have been prone to paralysis, inconsistency, and the triumph of special interests over general welfare. Hobbes countered. Your constraints on decision-making become obstacles to effective governance. When every policy must be negotiated among competing authorities, the result is often policy that serves no one well while claiming to serve everyone. An elderly man near the fireplace, who had introduced himself earlier as a retired ambassador, finally spoke up. Gentlemen, if I may, I have spent 40 years watching governments around the world, and I would say you are both partially correct. Some cultures seem to thrive under strong central authority, while others require more distributed power structures. Perhaps the optimal system depends on historical, cultural, and economic factors rather than universal principles. Both philosophers turned toward him with interest, and Montesquieu nodded thoughtfully. The ambassador raises an important point about cultural variation. What works in one context may fail catastrophically in another. But surely there are some universal principles about human dignity and freedom that transcend cultural differences. Are there? Hobbes asked pointedly. Or is that merely Western arrogance disguised as universal truth? Perhaps the Chinese preference for collective harmony over individual rights reflects genuinely different values, rather than false consciousness imposed by authoritarian government. The question touched on contemporary debates about cultural relativism and universal human rights, bringing their historical argument into sharp contact with current controversies. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the minefield they were entering. Montesquieu chose his words carefully. I would argue that the desire for security, prosperity, and some measure of self-determination appears in all cultures, even if expressed differently. The question is which type of government better serves those universal human needs. And I would argue that security must come first, Hobbes replied. Without basic order, neither prosperity nor self-determination is possible. A starving person in a failed state has neither freedom nor dignity, regardless of how theoretically representative their government might be. The rain drummed harder against the windows, and the fire crackled louder, as if nature itself were emphasizing the intensity of their exchange. The clock above the bar showed nearly midnight, but nobody in the philosopher's den seemed inclined to leave. The debate between Montesquieu and Hobbes had evolved beyond academic exercise into something approaching revelation, two brilliant minds pushing each other toward insights that neither might have reached alone. The remaining patrons sat in rapt attention, witnesses to an intellectual event they would remember for the rest of their lives. The bartender, who had long since given up any pretense of normal operations, brought both men fresh drinks and settled into a chair he had pulled up near their table. Gentlemen, he said quietly, I have to ask, where does this leave us? We live in a world where both your arguments seem to be playing out simultaneously. We see democratic paralysis and authoritarian efficiency, constitutional protections and emergency powers, global cooperation and nationalist retreat. How do we choose? Montesquieu and Hobbes exchanged a look that contained something new, not just intellectual respect, but a kind of mutual recognition that they had pushed each other into territory that neither had fully explored before. Perhaps, Montesquieu said slowly, the question is not which system to choose, but how to design systems that can adapt to changing circumstances without losing their essential character. My separation of powers was never meant to be rigid dogma, but a flexible framework for channeling human ambition in constructive directions. Hobbes nodded thoughtfully. And perhaps my emphasis on sovereign authority was never meant to justify tyranny, but to ensure that someone, somewhere, retains the ability to act decisively when collective action fails. The sovereign I envision is constrained not by competing institutions, but by practical necessity and enlightened self-interest. The young law student who had spoken earlier leaned forward. So you are both saying that the choice between concentrated and distributed power is not binary, that effective governance requires elements of both. I think, Montesquieu replied, that we are saying something more subtle than that. We are saying that power must be organized in ways that account for human nature, while channeling it toward constructive ends. Whether that requires separation of powers or unified authority may depend on specific circumstances. But it must always, Hobbes added, recognize that governance is ultimately about human beings making decisions under uncertainty, with incomplete information and conflicting pressures. Perfect systems are impossible because perfect humans are impossible. A hush fell over the tavern as the implications of this convergence settled in. After hours of passionate disagreement, the two philosophers had not reached identical conclusions, but they had found common ground in their recognition of human limitation and the complexity of political choice. The documentary filmmaker stepped forward slightly. Professor Montesquieu, Professor Hobbes, may I ask one final question? Given everything you have discussed tonight, what advice would you give to citizens trying to evaluate their own governments? Montesquieu considered the question carefully. I would say, demand transparency, insist on accountability, and never trust any system that cannot be peacefully changed. But also recognize that perfect government is impossible, and that the alternatives to imperfect governance are usually worse. Hobbes leaned back in his chair. And I would add, judge your government not by its rhetoric but by its results, not by its promises, but by its performance. Demand effectiveness, but understand that effectiveness sometimes requires difficult choices that may not please everyone. Both of you seem to be saying, the bartender observed, that citizens need to be engaged and informed, regardless of what system they live under. Exactly, both men said simultaneously, then looked at each other with surprise and amusement. Montesquieu raised his glass. To my worthy opponent, who has forced me to think more deeply about questions I thought I had already answered. Hobbes raised his mug in response. And to my esteemed colleague, who has reminded me that the pursuit of order must never become the abandonment of justice. They drank, and the tavern erupted in spontaneous applause. The debate had ended not with victory for either side, but with something more valuable, a deeper understanding of the eternal tensions that define political life. As the patrons began to file out into the rain-soaked night, conversations buzzed with excitement about what they had witnessed. The young law student was already planning to write her thesis on the questions raised during the evening. The retired ambassador was composing emails to former colleagues about the insights he had gained. The philosophy professor was reconsidering how she would teach political theory in the coming semester. At the corner table, Montesquieu and Hobbes sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their audience disperse. Finally, the Frenchman spoke. You know, Thomas, I suspect we will be having variations of this conversation for as long as human beings attempt to govern themselves. Indeed, Hobbes replied, and perhaps that is as it should be. The moment we stop questioning how power should be organized is the moment we stop deserving the freedoms that power is meant to protect. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean for whatever debates tomorrow might bring. Inside the philosopher's den, two of history's greatest political minds had reminded everyone present that the most important questions are not the ones with easy answers, but the ones that force us to think more carefully about what we value and why. The bartender turned off the lights one by one, leaving only the dying fire to illuminate the now empty corner table where democracy and authority had wrestled with each other into the night, reaching not a conclusion, but a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human governance itself.